let's jump right into this because I think it's important that we break this down first so a lot of you people can understand. Because what we're going to do, we're going to be pulling back the curtain on one of the longest running and most misunderstood land grabs in modern history, the colonization of South Africa and how Black South Africans were robbed of their land and their identity and of course their future, because majority of South Africans, okay, Black South Africans live in poverty. They live in squalor. They live in shanty towns. So we're going to be diving into how 7% of the population who are white South Africans came to control more than 70% of the farmland. Think about that. Not only do they own land, but it's farmland where they're growing food, they have cattle, so they control the very economics of the country to a certain degree. And how the roots of this injustice stretch back hundreds of years, because referencing the map here, the Dutch arrived around 1652, because in 1652, those so-called Dutch settlers or colonizers in this regard, under the Dutch East Indian Company, landed at the Cape of Good Hope. And the commander, who was, I believe, Jan van Riebeeck, the commander didn't come to settle initially. The VOC just wanted a refreshment station for ships sailing to and from Asia. But like all colonial stories, greed got in the way. Soon the Dutch started seizing land from the indigenous Kiowa people, okay, we're gonna call them Koa people or Ko, who had lived and grazed cattle in the region for generations. The Dutch called themselves Boers, meaning farmers, and later Afrikaners. They brought enslaved people from Indonesia and Madagascar and India, but the local African population also became victims of enslavement and disposition. Now, if we fast forward to 1795, Britain invaded and took the Cape Colony from the Dutch. They gave it back briefly, but by 1806, they took it permanently. And the British introduced new laws and economic systems that further marginalized Black South Africans, including the Xhosa, the Zulu, the Sotho peoples. British land policies facilitated white ownership while pushing Black communities, by pushing back Black communities into labor systems and native reserves, which is basically a preview of the apartheid. And tensions rose between the British and the Boers. Okay, these two white different groups, the British and the Boers, who are from the Netherlands, who are the Dutch, leading to the infamous Great Trek, the 1830s to the 1840s, where Dutch settlers moved north and east, established the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. Those areas gained through warfare and the displacement of African kingdoms. Now, if we look at the 19th century, because the 19th century was marked by fierce resistance from African leaders like Shaka Zulu, who transformed the Zulu kingdom into a military powerhouse, Moshe Wee, who defended the Bosto kingdom, and Xhosa chiefs who fought in 9 bloody frontier wars against British colonizers. Now, despite their bravery, European firepower, their alliances, and diseases decimated many of these kingdoms. Because don't forget, a lot of their gunpowder technology was their partnership and collaboration with the Chinese at the time. Now that we fast forward a little bit to the gold and diamond rush of 1867 through 1886, South Africa's land wasn't just valuable for farming, it was loaded with diamonds and gold. When these resources were discovered, British imperialism intensified. Mining magnates like Cecil Rhodes envisioned a British empire stretching from Cape to Cairo. They used laws, force, and manipulation to drive Black Africans off of mineral-rich lands and into mines as cheap labor. The Minerals and Mining Acts excluded Black people from ownership and skill work in their own country, on their own land that was stolen. Africans were now landless, taxed, and forced into the migrant labor system, working in hellish mines while white capitalists got rich. And this is very, very similar to the conditions of Black Americans. That's why when you speak about the apartheid, you have to go back a little bit further because there was things occurring that kind of led up to the apartheid. But the apartheid is quite recent, more so than all the other tragedies that people have been facing. And that's why, in some regards, South Africans and Black Americans in America, we hold a lot of relations in some of the atrocities that our ancestors have been through and some of the persecution that we're still facing today. We have our president, President Donald J. Trump, who on national TV with the president of South Africa made outlandish allegations stating that white Afrikaners, white Boers, white South Africans were being genocided, which was a big fat lie. The first question I have for that is, why didn't the Netherlands come out and speak against this white genocide in South Africa? These are the ancestors. This is the ancestors' country of the white South Africans. Majority of them are from the Netherlands. A lot of their language in South Africa is a mixture of Swahili and Netherlands and German to make that that white South African Afrikaners language. So when we look at the demographics of things and the allegations that President Trump made that almost every news agency has debunked, was this trying to be justified to bring over 59 unprivileged, seems to be impoverished white South Africans? I just don't know the answers to that. I just don't know the answer to that. But there must be a bigger ploy. Because again, when we look at the legal theft of this, the 1913 Natives Land Act, because this act, perhaps the single most devastating policy in South African history, legally barred South Africans, the Black South Africans, then 80% of the population, 80% of the population from owning land in over 87% of the country. So they were marginalized to only 13% of their own land to have their own farms, while the other 87% was owned, operated, and controlled by the Boers, by the white South Africans. This is just the history. This is just the history. I thank you guys for joining me here this afternoon, but we're going to break this down, family. We're going to break this down because, again, for people who are just getting around the story of white people being genocide in a Black-owned country, it's just a big headline that nobody really knows the history, and that the claims and the allegations that the president made are false. They're lies. And the picture that he showed, and I think I have a picture here to show you guys this picture that he showed to state that here are the bodies of the white South Africans that have been genocide. This picture is not even in South Africa. This is in the Congo. This is in the Congo. So again, we continue to see lies. Now, when we talk about the 1913 Natives Land Act, as I was stating that, 80% of the population were Black from owning land in particularly 87% of the country, they were restricted to the reserves, just 7% of the land. And it's institutionalized land theft and racial inequality. That's like telling someone you can live here, but you can't own anything. You can work the land, but it will never be yours. It sounds like Black Americans in America, does it not? But I digress. So let's jump right into the apartheid, because this is important as well. Between 1948 to 1994, we're talking about racial capitalism on steroids, because the white minority National Party made segregation official in 1948 with the apartheid. 1948 to 1994. A lot of you have been alive through the era of 1948 to 1994. And we have present day slavery to a certain degree, definitely segregation by the way of the apartheid in South Africa, because under apartheid, Black South Africans couldn't vote, own land in most areas, or even move freely without a passbook. The same thing we had was freedom papers. or we had to have a signed permission slip to go from one plantation to another plantation because certain of our black ancestors who they deem and label as slaves has certain skills. He's a blacksmith. Okay. He's a cowboy, because don't forget, the first true cowboys were black. They're the ones who were tending to the agriculture, into the cattle, into the goats and all of those things. And they were doing cattle, they were doing cows, and they were being called boys, even though they were grown men. So those were their first original cowboys. You can do your research for yourself. This is not a wild, outlandish claim. So as we get into the thick of things, Black South Africans couldn't vote on land, okay? Again, without those so-called freedom papers. And the land was kept in white hands through laws like the Group Areas Act that forced removals of black communities, totally moving whole communities. The same thing that is similar to what? Redlining. And what we're saying today is gentrification. What about the Bantu Authorities Act, creation of homelands to divide and conquer? The Lands Act of 1936 and 1955 reinforced earlier laws to limit African ownership and autonomy. By 1994, white South Africans, less than 10% of the population, owned over 87% of the land. And how do you think they got that land? You think they bought that land from the South African black government? No. Don't forget, during the apartheid, the white South Africans, the Afrikaners, aka the Boers, they owned and operate every piece of the South African government that you can absolutely name. They own the infrastructure, the government, the economics, the food, the water, the resources. They own and operate and control absolutely everything. Absolutely everything that they had, they own and operated and control. And throughout that time, don't get me wrong, resistance never died. From the African National Congress, also known as the ANC, to the Pan-African Congress, also known as the PAC, from Steve Biko's Black Consciousness Movement to the armed struggle of the MKs, the South Africans fought back. Man, you had some co-opted leaders that is now coming out today, like Nelson Mandela. They said that he was co-opted by the white powers that was controlling everything. But you also had other people in the mix like Oliver Tambo and Chris Haney led into internal resistance. Meanwhile, movements like who? The Black Panther Party inspired solidarity across oceans. That's right. Black Americans were standing up for Black South Africans through the apartheid of what they were going through. We were protesting. We was giving outcries to our government to stop the genocide of Black South Africans and the control and the apartheid that was occurring there. Now, in 1994, the apartheid failed. Nelson Mandela became president. The ANC promised land reform. But here's the tragedy. As of 2023, 2024, over 70% of the farmland is still in white hands, even though whites only make up 7 to 8% of the population. Why? The willing buyer, the willing seller policy. It failed. Lack of political will and corruption. And we were talking about the elite capture. Black elites gain political power, but the masses remain landless. Underfunded land reform programs, because before the current president, I'm just going to call him President Ramsey. Before the current president, those puppets that the white power structure from Europe had in place in South Africa, that's 7 to 8% of people, of the white South Africans, owned and operated still everything. And even to this day, over 70% of the farmland in South Africa are owned by white South Africans. So again, one of the most important questions is, why is America involved in this? Why is our president calling out and making allegations that Black South Africans are being genocidal towards white South African farmers or white South Africans altogether, where every news, it seems as though every news, not every, but it seems though a majority of news agencies from around the world stating that is untrue. Don't you think all these countries in Europe would have stated the same thing? They would have made the same claims. And do you believe that any of these other white countries, Spain, Portugal, Belgium, Netherlands, Germany, Italy, France, Norway, Greenland, Iceland, Finland, Switzerland, all these different people and all these groups have been to South Africa and have colonized them in some way or some form or some fashion, or through the illegal gold and diamonds trade? Why do you think none of them came out and solidified and verified the claims that President Trump has made? Because they were false. Because the first country that, in my opinion, that would have made claims or stood up or sent troops or made threatening terms to South Africa would have been the Netherlands. Because those white South Africans, a lot of their ancestry is from the Netherlands. That is their home country. They are the descendants of the Dutch who colonized South Africa.